So we've now left the greenway and we've come up a kind of hogging path that was laid down in I believe the 18th century into the woodlands of the pond groves. In front of us there's a beautiful mature lime tree. You can see the main trunk, and then coming off the trunk are a large number of smaller stems. Now the way that lime grows naturally is to have numerous suckers growing from the base, and each of those smaller slender trunks was originally a small sucker that's now growing up, and eventually they will grow and bend to the side, and if they were to come down and touch the ground they would reroot. Lime was often planted because it's one of the best trees you can use for carving, and so for example for Forty Hall, all the splendid wooden carving that we have in the hall is probably from lime wood, and our greatest, I believe, 17th or 18th century wood carver, Gibeus Gibbons, used to use lime wood extensively.
It's also a favourite for bees, isn't it, a lime tree?
Indeed, yes. Actually from the bark a sap is exuded, which the bees love. Aphids also love it, and they suck the sap out of the leaves. And often if you have a car that's parked underneath a lime tree, you'll see it's covered in black sooty mess, and that's where the aphids have passed the sap through the body, splashes onto the car bonnet, and then it collects the dust. So as I mentioned before, the understory plants are predominantly spring flowering plants and bulbs. We have a lot of snowdrops growing in this area. Reportedly they were planted by local residents 10-15 years ago, and they're spreading across the area. There's probably some native snowdrops here as well. In January-February time, depending on the season, they look absolutely stunning as you walk across here. Another plant I want to show you at the back, this one here. So this plant is known common name of butcher's broom. It's nationally very rare, but on this estate it's quite a frequent occurrence. It's called butcher's broom. This is actually very hard, almost like a holly, and butchers would cut it and use it as a broom on their meat tables. So if you imagine the medieval market, all the muck, the flies and everything else, good old butcher's broom would keep the flies off your meat. I believe it's semi-parasitic, so it's probably its roots integrated with the roots of the hornbeam tree next to it, so it can take out some of the sap. And it has little red berries, and I imagine most of those have been eaten by birds over winter. But it's a lovely evergreen plant. You can use it in gardening, and it just grows here naturally. So we have an awful lot of wildfowl who come in and use the ornamental lake near the hall, the Pondgrove Lakes here, and Turkey Brook. You can just see down the shore there a pair of drake mallards, the males. We also have mandarins. There's a wonderful heron. He comes to almost all the ponds and lakes that we have on the estate. And a number of geese, our native geese and Canadian geese. And occasionally we have swans flying in as well.
And you might be able to hear in the background one of the summer visitor warblers, and I can't identify which one. Get a small prize if you can.
So here we have a pile of cut silver birch. It's more white than silver, and traditionally the bark would have been cut down a trunk and then peeled off to create a large flat piece of bark that was used as a waterproof membrane. And around the Baltic, Scandinavia and all across the UK, traditionally it was that bark that was used on turf roofs as a waterproofing agent. You can also get sap from the tree, which is often used as a sweetener, and it obviously has the lovely white form, and the more you rub it, the whiter it becomes. So from the main hogging track there are numerous smaller footpaths coming off, leading up the hill. Each of these routes will take you back onto the parkland of the Great Field and then up into the hall. If we go up here to the right, we can then come to Crater Pond and Meadow Pond. So we're now at Crater Pond. The name Crater may have derived from a World War I or World War II bomb that exploded. However, on the old estate maps, there would seem to have been a pond in this area before the World Wars. This is the favourite haunt of our beautiful grey heron. He's seated at the back shore there. And it's also one of our breeding ponds for the great crested newt, which obviously is an endangered species, and we're doing everything we can to ensure that we retain the breeding population. So we're doing some tree felling work to let light into the area. We're removing any dead leaf fall that builds up and accumulates, so we have a constant level of the water level. And we've also cut bat corridors, so that's where you take out vegetation at certain heights based on the ideal flying height of the different species of bat that we have on the estate. Later this year we'll be planting other native species that we've collected from the estate to plant around what is now just the muddy shore, because that's ideal habitat for great crested newts as well when they leave the water. So here on the shores of Crater Pond, we've cut some of the trees down to this kind of height to create a pollard. This will let light come in, and pollarding is the traditional tree management that you find near to ponds. The evidence we have for that is over on this side, which is one of the oldest pollards that we have on the estate. So all the hornbeam seedlings which have grown around the area probably came from this mother tree. And this was a huge pollard. It may look like three separate trees, but actually if I step in the middle, this was one enormous tree, and slowly each branch has fallen back and tilted, and for centuries this has been maintained and managed as a pollard. It means it's got wonderful habitat inside all the fissured bark for bats and beetles, and then all the fresh growth, which is encouraged by regular pruning. Every year, 5-10 years you prune. That's all great for insects who want to come and eat the leaves, and for birds. This is one of my favourite trees on the whole estate. So we've now come up on the footpath track that leads from Pondgroves leading back to the Great Fields and Forty Hall. And here at the edge of the Pondgrove woodlands are two of my most favourite trees on the estate, which are beautiful old sweet chestnut trees. Sweet chestnuts are edible, so if you think of chestnuts roasting on an open fire, that is the sweet chestnut. Something I love about the tree is actually the bark. It's so fissured and deep and sculptural. When we had the St Jude storm, I was very worried that maybe these had blown down, but thankfully they're still here. There's a lot of woodland growth that's come up around them, so what we may do later in the autumn is just to give them a little bit more space by reducing the trees that are coming to touch the canopy. So the feature you can see in the shot here is a Hibernacula, which is a fancy way of saying a place where amphibians and possibly reptiles would be hibernating or going into their winter dormancy period. It's constructed with 3 or 4 layers of natural stone at the base, leaving gaps where the creatures can crawl in over winter. It's then covered with turf and soil, which works as thermal massing to keep the frost out. And we've placed some more willow logs in the front just to provide extra niches for different creatures and wildlife. This is the first one that's been created by the contractor who's doing the restoration works, and later in the coming years we'll be doing others with volunteers. So we're now at Meadow Pond. This is the second of our large ponds on the estate. Again, possibly dug out by hand as a deer pond in the Middle Ages, or the Tudor era when the Elsing Palace was developed on the estate, or possibly it was dug by hand for cattle later on in the Jacobean era. So again, we're maintaining this pond for the great crested newts and all the unique wildlife that we have in the ponds. We've put some chestnut pale fencing around, really just to stop dogs from going into the area disturbing the wildlife, and they're held up by more pollards. And each of these pollarded branches was cut from the tree to my right hand side. So this is our native crack willow. You see we've cut it all down. This lets more light come into the pond. It reduces the number of leaves filling up the sediment in the pond. And you can see that now all the spring growth is coming back. So this tree is still alive, and it's provided the branches for every other new pollard that we've got in this area, which are about 35 or 40 new pollards we planted this autumn. So part of our land management for this estate is high-level stewardship through Natural England. And Natural England has had a few requirements of what they'd like us to promote. One of those was countryside crafts and traditional ways of enclosing the landscape. Whilst we do Heritage Lottery Fund activities, one of those activities was to have a foraging area. So here we've combined the two together. So we have the traditional pollarding, using different types of wood and timber that we've cut from the estate as woven poles to make the wicker hurdles, which is a traditional way of enclosing areas of the landscape, and behind chestnut pale fencing. The plants we've planted in this area are our native elderberry, hazel, and later we'll be having dog roses and brambles, so anybody who wants to come into the area and forage for food can do so at their leisure. It'll also become an educational resource for when we bring our numerous school visit groups down to teach them how they can forage for food themselves in the landscape. In the far corner we've got some habitat piles, and we've also created hedgehog shelters and homes, and we're hoping to do small mammal release later on over the forthcoming years of the activity programme. So when we were here 2 weeks ago, the trunks that we'd planted as new pollards only had tiny buds on them. And now you can see the regrowth, or what's known as the spring, is coming up. About 15 centimetres in 2 weeks, which is a pretty fast growth rate. You can say spring has sprung. So if you remember, Mike, when we first came here 3 weeks ago, there was not a single leaf out on any of the trees, or other than the evergreens. See how it's changed now.
In a very short period of time, it's been completely transformed. Lovely. That brings us to the end of our spring walk. Thank you very much, Jason.
My pleasure.
I think we both deserve a hot chocolate at the cafe. What do you say?
Yep.